In 1563, a young lawyer named Étienne de la Boétie died of plague in Bordeaux. He was 32 years old. He had been Michel de Montaigne's closest friend for 4 years. 4 years that Montaigne would spend the remaining 28 years of his life trying to describe, to understand, and to survive. He could not explain the friendship. He tried. In the essay he eventually wrote about it, On Friendship, perhaps the most famous of all his essays, he reached for every available framework and found each one inadequate. It was not the friendship of utility, the kind that serves mutual interest and dissolves when the interest disappears. It was not the friendship of pleasure, the kind that warms you in company and fades when the company ends. It was not the friendship of virtue in Aristotle's careful sense, though virtue was present in it. He kept arriving at the same place, the same sentence, the sentence that has been returned to for 450 years by every person who has read it and recognized in it the only honest account they'd ever encountered of the thing they were trying to say. Because it was him, because it was me. That is all. That is the whole explanation. Not a reason, not a cause, not a principle from which the friendship could be derived, or a theory from which it could be predicted. The recognition, the bare, specific, unreasonable, entirely sufficient recognition that this person and I belonged to each other in a way that did not require justification and could not be replaced. Montaigne wrote that essay in grief. He wrote it as the single literary monument he intended to build over La Boétie's tomb, a monument in words, because words were what he had. And in the writing, he discovered something about the nature of the loss that he spent the rest of his life unpacking. When La Boétie died, something went with him that could not be recovered. Not a quality of life, not a source of pleasure or support or companionship, something more fundamental. The part of Montaigne that had existed in relation to La Boétie, the self that had been called into being by that specific friendship, that had known itself most clearly in that particular company, had nowhere left to be. He wrote, because it was him, because it was me. What he did not write, because it went without saying, was the terrible corollary. Because it was him, and he is gone, a version of me has gone with him, and no future friendship, however good, however real, however genuinely valued, will bring that version back. There is a loss that most people in midlife carry that is different from the losses that grief counseling and self-help and the culture's language for bereavement were designed to address. Not the loss of a person through death, though that may be part of it. The loss of a relationship through distance, through drift, through the quiet divergence of two lives that once ran closely parallel and no longer do. The friend you were closest to in your 20s, who is still alive, still technically present, but who you now see twice a year and speak to in the careful, slightly managed way of people who share a history but no longer share a world. The colleague who knew you most clearly in the context of work you did together, and who, when the work ended, took with them the version of you that had existed inside it. The marriage that is intact but has changed, that was one thing and now is another, and in the space between those two things, something that cannot be named has quietly been lost. We have language for grief. We have almost no language for this, for the loss of the self that existed in a specific relationship, the version of you that only that person knew and called into being, and that has nowhere to live now that the relationship has ended or changed or cooled into something less than it was.
Montaigne had this loss at 30, with a completeness and a finality that gave it an unusual clarity. And what he did with it, what he built from the wreckage of the friendship that had been the central relationship of his adult life, was not recovery in any ordinary sense. It was something harder and stranger and more honest. He built an essay and in the building he discovered that the only adequate response to the loss of the irreplaceable is not the replacement of it, not the recovery from it in the sense of moving beyond it, but the full, honest, permanently open acknowledgment that it cannot be replaced, and that this acknowledgment is not the end of living, but the beginning of understanding what living, at its most serious, actually requires. Michel de Montaigne was born in 1533 at the Château de Montaigne in the Périgord region of southwest France, the son of a prosperous merchant family with ambitions toward the nobility. His father, Pierre Ichem, was an unusual man in a conventional age, curious, humanistic, convinced that his son's education should be guided by gentleness rather than severity, and sufficiently committed to this conviction that he arranged for young Michel to be awakened each morning not by the voice of a tutor, but by a musician playing a stringed instrument. He was educated in Latin as a first language before French, an experiment in total linguistic immersion that was, by any measure, successful. He studied law at Bordeaux and then at Toulouse, joined the Bordeaux Parlement as a counselor at 21, and moved in the legal and governmental circles of southwestern France with the ease of a man who had been prepared for exactly this world. He met Boétie in 1558 or 59 at the Parlement. Boétie was 2 years older, already at 25 a writer of considerable distinction, the author of a remarkable political essay called The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, that argued, with the clarity that made the authorities nervous, that political tyranny depends entirely on the consent of the governed. He was brilliant, principled, and by every account someone whose company produced in the people around him a specific quality of intellectual aliveness that they recognized as rare. The friendship was immediate and total. Montaigne would later write that they had found each other so completely, had known each other so quickly and so thoroughly, that it seemed less like a friendship that had developed than like one that had been recognized, as if the connection had already existed and the meeting had simply made it visible. They had 4 years. Boétie died in August of 1563 of an epidemic illness, attended by Montaigne throughout his dying. Montaigne's account of the deathbed, preserved in a letter to his father, is one of the most affecting documents in French literature. He describes Boétie asking for him repeatedly in the last hours, reaching for his hand, saying things that Montaigne records with the precise, loving, devastated attention of a person who understands he is receiving the last communication of someone irreplaceable. After the death, Montaigne stayed in the Parlement for another decade. He married, a practical marriage, warm enough, but never the central relationship of his life. He had children, most of whom died young. He served as mayor of Bordeaux twice. He moved through the obligations and duties of the public life he had been educated for. And then, in 1571, at 38, roughly the age at which human beings have been withdrawing from the world to take stock of what they have done with it since at least the time of Montaigne, he retired to the Tower Library of the Château de Montaigne, had a medal struck to commemorate his retirement, and began writing the essays that would make him one of the most widely read writers in the Western world. The essays are many things. They are explorations of everything from cannibalism to coaches to the experience of nearly dying from a writing accident. They are the first sustained attempt in European literature to treat the individual self, the specific, particular, unrepeatable self of a single person living a single life, as a subject worthy of serious literary and philosophical attention. They are, in Virginia Woolf's judgment, the best company in the world. But underneath all of them, as the foundation from which everything else in the essays grows, is the loss of Boétie, the friendship that was the defining relationship of Montaigne's life, that lasted 4 years, and that he spent the next 28 years writing around, writing toward, and writing in the absence of. He never recovered. That is not a tragedy. It is the most honest thing Montaigne ever said.
On Friendship is the essay. It is not long, perhaps 20 pages in a modern translation, and its central argument is one that most people who have lost a genuine friendship
will recognize immediately, and that most philosophical accounts of friendship either ignore or systematically undervalue. Most philosophical accounts of friendship, Aristotle's, Cicero's, the accounts that Montaigne knew and cites and politely sets aside, treat friendship as a relationship between two independent selves that benefits both. The friends are improved by the friendship. They become better, wiser, more virtuous through the association. The friendship serves the flourishing of each individual, and when the friendship ends through death or distance or the natural dissolution that most friendships eventually undergo, the individuals remain, diminished perhaps, but intact, carrying forward what the friendship gave them. Montaigne says this is wrong, or rather, not wrong, but insufficient, not a full account of what genuine friendship is or what its loss actually costs. In genuine friendship, in the particular, rare, specific kind of friendship that he is trying to describe, the selves do not remain independent. They become, over time, entangled in a way that cannot be fully undone. They know each other in ways that are not transferable, that exist only in the specific relational space between those two people, and that disappear when that space closes. A version of each self exists inside the friendship that has nowhere else to go, that cannot be known by anyone else because no one else created the conditions for it to exist. When Boétie died, Montaigne lost not only his friend, he lost the self that had existed in relation to his friend, the version of Montaigne that Boétie knew and that Boétie's knowing had called into being. That version of Montaigne had nowhere left to go. It could not move to another friendship because no other friendship had made it. It could not survive in memory because memory preserves the image of what was, but cannot preserve the living relational reality in which it existed. It was simply gone as Boétie himself. This is what because it was him, because it was me is actually saying. It is not saying we were well matched. It is not saying I valued his qualities. It is saying the connection between us was of the kind that cannot be explained by the qualities of either party separately, that arose from the specific chemistry of these two people together, and that produced, in both of us, a version of ourselves that exists nowhere else and will never exist again. That is the honest thing, the thing that the culture's language for loss keeps sliding past, that some losses are not recoverable because what was lost was not a possession, but a relational reality, a specific, unrepeatable self-in-connection that existed only in that friendship and that went with the friendship when it went. Now the bridge. Because Montaigne was a 16th century French nobleman writing about the loss of a specific friendship in a world very different from the present one. But here is what has not changed since 1563. The friend who knew the version of you that existed at 25, in the apartment, in the context, in the specific shared world that no longer exists. The colleague who knew the version of you that existed inside a particular piece of work, a particular team, a particular period of your professional life. The partner who knew the version of you in the early years of the relationship, the version that was called into being by the newness of it, by the specific quality of being seen by someone for the first time, and who is still present, but who knew that version in a way that the current version cannot be fully known. The loss of these relationships, through death, through distance, through the ordinary drift of lives that once ran together and no longer do, is real. It is not the same as the loss of a quality or a pleasure or a source of support. It is the loss of a self, a specific, relational, unrepeatable self that existed in that particular connection and nowhere else.
Montaigne is not offering you comfort about this. He is offering you something more valuable. He is offering you the most honest account of what the loss actually is, so that you can stop trying to recover from it in the ways that the culture proposes, which are the ways that work for ordinary losses, and start doing the harder, stranger, more honest thing that this kind of loss actually requires, which is to carry it. Not to resolve it, not to replace it, not to grow past it into a healthier, more resilient self that has learned to love more wisely, to carry it with the full acknowledgment of what it is, with the honest recognition of what went with it, with the specific, respectful refusal to pretend that the version of yourself that existed in that friendship is available somewhere else if you look hard enough. Because it was him, because it was me, and because what that means for the person who has lived it is that something exists now only in memory that once existed in the world, and that the memory, however faithful, is not the same thing, and that knowing this clearly, carrying it clearly, without the softening that the culture keeps offering, is not morbidity. It is the honest examination of what genuine connection costs and what it was worth. Here is what Montaigne on friendship asks of you, practically, today. First, name the loss that has no adequate name. Not the bereavement, the relational loss, the friendship that drifted, the relationship that changed, the version of yourself that existed in a specific connection and that you have been carrying without a name for it. The culture's language for this is thin. Montaigne's language is not. He spent 28 years finding words for the specific, irreducible reality of what it means to lose the person who knew you in a way no one else has. Give the loss a name, not a resolution, not a lesson it taught you or a growth it produced. The loss itself, the specific relational reality that ended it, the version of yourself that went with it, the honest acknowledgment, in writing, in thought, in whatever form your own version of the Tower Library takes, that something was there and is no longer there and cannot be retrieved. This naming is not grief work in the therapeutic sense. It is philosophy in Montaigne's sense, the honest examination of what is actually true, with the refusal to substitute a more manageable account for the real one. Second, resist the replacement. Montaigne did not replace La Boétie. He had other friendships, warm, real, valued. He had the friendship of his adopted daughter, Marie de Gournay, who became the editor of his essays and one of the most devoted literary relationships of the 16th century. He had the company of his readers, which he cultivated with the essays as deliberately as any friendship he formed in person. None of them were La Boétie. He never said they were. He never performed the consoling fiction that the grief had been resolved by the subsequent friendships, that the hole La Boétie left had been filled by other goods. He carried the absence alongside the presences.
This is not a counsel of grief. It is a counsel of honesty. The person who tries to replace the irreplaceable, who seeks in the next friendship or the next relationship the version of themselves that existed in the lost one, is not moving forward. They are performing a recovery that has not occurred, and the performance is exhausting, and it does not work, and it diminishes both the lost friendship and the new one by asking the new one to be something it cannot be. Let the new be new. Let the lost be lost. Carry both. That is the Montaigne practice. Third, write toward the person you lost. The essays are, in a sense, a 40-year letter to La Boétie. Montaigne wrote about everything, about fear and pain and friendship and cannibals and the experience of nearly dying, but he wrote about all of it in the presence of an absence. The essays are addressed to the reader, but they exist in the space that La Boétie left. Find your form of this, the journal entry that addresses the person who is gone. The letter you write and do not send, or write and do send, or write and keep. The conversation in your mind that you have been having with someone who is no longer in your life, that you carry as an internal dialogue, the way Montaigne carried the dialogue with La Boétie through every essay he wrote. Give that internal conversation a form, because form is not the same as resolution. It is the act of treating the relationship as what it was, serious, real, worthy of the attention, rather than something to be processed and moved past. Fourth, hold the because it was him. Find a friendship, present or lost, or somewhere in the uncertain middle, that you cannot explain, that you cannot reduce to the qualities of the other person, or the benefits to yourself, or the history you share, that exists in its deepest register as a fact before it exists as an explanation, because it was them, because it is you, because the specific chemistry of these two people together has produced a relational reality that has no other address in the world. Name it that way, not as a description of what it gives you, as a recognition of what it is, rare, specific, unrepeatable, and worth everything that genuine friendship costs, which is, Montaigne would say, not a small amount, but which is also, for the person who has had it, worth everything that it is. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Montaigne on friendship. Not the essay, not the Tower Library, or the retirement medal, or the 28 years of writing. The Deathbed, August 1563. Montaigne holding Boétie's hand in the last hours, recording everything, the words, the gestures, the repeated calling of his name. The letter to his father written immediately after, in the specific, stunned, meticulously precise prose of a person who understands they are writing down the last communication of someone who cannot be replaced. The 28-year-old who has just understood, in the most complete and final way available to a human being, what because it was him, because it was me, actually means.
He walked out of that room carrying something that he would carry for 28 more years. Not the memory of La Boétie, though he had that, the knowledge of what genuine connection is and what its loss costs. The honest, permanently open, never recovered from understanding that the deepest friendships are not experiences that happen to a self, but relational realities in which a self comes into being, and that the loss of them is therefore not the loss of something a self has, but the loss of something a self is. He built the essays on that knowledge. He offered them to the world as the most honest account he could produce of what it means to be a human being who has loved someone irreplaceable and lost them. He did not offer resolution. He did not offer the wisdom that made the loss bearable in any ordinary sense of bearable. He offered company, the company of a person who had been there, who had felt exactly what you feel, who had looked at the loss as clearly as he could manage and written it down, not to recover from it, but to know it fully, and who had discovered in the knowing that the full acknowledgment of what cannot be recovered is not the end of living. It is the beginning of the kind of living that knows what it has and what it has lost, and holds both, without pretending either is other than it is. Here is the question Montaigne on friendship leaves us with today. Not from the Tower Library, not from the essay, from the deathbed, from the 30-year-old holding the hand of the person who knew him most completely in the last hours that person had. Who is the La Boétie of your life? Not the best friend in the ordinary sense, the person, present or lost or somewhere in between, in whose company a version of yourself exists that has no other address. The relationship that you cannot explain, that you would not exchange for a more manageable one, that costs you something specific and gives you something that nothing else gives. And if you have lost that person, to death, to distance, to the quiet drift that lives undergo, what would it mean to stop trying to recover from it in the ways that recovery is usually described? To carry the loss instead of managing it, to acknowledge fully what went with it, to honor in the only way honoring works for the irreplaceable, the fact that it was real. Leave that in the comments. because naming the because it was him, even briefly, even privately, is the beginning of the honest accounting that Montaigne spent 28 years practicing, not to resolve the loss, to know it clearly enough that the knowing itself becomes, as he promised it would, a form of company. I'll see you in the next one.